And we are back. Welcome to the Bottomless Podcast. That is spelled BTTMLESS. If you are a return listener, my God, I am humbled. We are humbled and thank you. If you are a new listener, welcome. And hopefully for y'all Christians who are trying to get an insight onto those who aren't Christian, then welcome. And maybe this will convince you to stay. If not for nothing else, then our beautiful brown faces and the topics. So let me go ahead and introduce everybody here.
Wow.
My name is Kevin, and you guys are
Vincent Lil V. Smith.
And Leslie.
Yeah, and so we're just three friends. I live in Floribama. Vince lives in LA. Leslie lives in Hawaii. And we're just three friends doing a podcast. Nobody important, nobody celebrity-like. We're just three casual friends, and we're just talking about stuff that we hope, because it's interesting to us, will be interesting to you guys.
And we are on our 5th episode, I believe. And I was curious for you guys how you feel now that we've broke the big 4-0 followers on Instagram. I was curious how you guys feel about having these conversations out in public. You know, once they're, once something's on the internet, it's like there forever. Yeah. So yeah, have you guys thought about that? Like, I feel like this topic that we're going to be discussing today is probably like the most conversation that you would usually have in like a private relational setting. But even before that, other stuff we're talking about, how do you feel about having that in a public space?
Vince, you want to take that first? You want me to take it first?
I mean, I actually feel pretty good about it. I feel like it's like we're like scrapbook, especially because we're friends. If we were strangers, maybe it'd be different. But it's nice to capture this moment in time forever and be able to reference it. Obviously, there's like considerations about what people that aren't us think when they listen to this, because they don't have the fullness of our relationships and the context. But it's kind of nice. It's like the anti-Instagram, right? Like, we're not really presenting the best of ourselves. We're just kind of like rambling, hopefully with some sort of coherence.
I love that.
I love that. Fun. I love that. Yeah. So I told Leslie and Vince this, I think, when we were like contemplating this, and I told Vince when we were contemplating this podcast, I told them this, and then I told Vince this like back in Christmas when I visited him in LA. I was like, yo, like, if nothing else, if someone came to you right now,
back in Christmas, was this podcast already percolating back then?
No. That was like just me talking about how I video diary.
Okay,
and so I was telling Vince, I was like, yo, like, what if someone came to you right now and said, I got 10 years of footage of your great-great-grandma or your great-great-grandpa. Like, would you want it? Like, I can give to you right now 10 years of footage of like their thoughts on politics on the time, social issues, religion, their life, their fears and apprehensions as an 18-year-old coming into the world and what career they should do, who they dated, what they thought about love, the struggle, and it was like, yeah, that would just like, for me, I just like, it's so funny how much money people will spend for like ancestry.com just to figure out the ethnicities that all go into contributing who they are. I just think it's a cool idea to like have, like the psychology, the personhood, the opinions, the thoughts of like the people you came, like your ancestors. And so like, until like video recording became a thing, like in our lifetime, honestly, video like became so accessible and so cheap. It wasn't really like a reality for like us to just have our great-great-grandparents on. We had to like go off, maybe if they had a diary, maybe if they wrote letters. But now it's like from us forward, all of our generations will be able to look back and go, like our kids can look to their kids and go, look, grandpa was like, this was grandpa. Like, even after we're dead and gone, this was your great-great-grandpa. Like, son, you see how in college you're like heartbroken and you're like wondering about what you should do in the world, and like you're not alone. This is this grandpa that we kind of like, we see him now, like he's dead now, but at 86, when he was still here with us, it was like he was powerful, he was strong, he was like calm, and he was so assured in life because he had lived life and he knew what life was. But now you get to see him in his or her in their insecurities and their fears and their hopes and their like all these beautiful mixtures of the mosaic of who you come from, and like just being able to feel that that cultural tribalness of community amongst family of like, man, like there's just something, it's almost like playing a video. It's almost like reading. It's just a cool idea. So for me, but also I see it that way because I'm a poet. And so I think I'm inclined to openness, and I'll just tell anyone anything about my life, even like when it involves like my mom, for example. My mom's like, yo, stop telling people shit about like about how I treated you as a kid. So I fucks with it. And I like the analogy of like the anti-Instagram because that's such a cool analogy. But I also understand that like it's kind of my inclination to be open as an artist to like really, really fuck with it. And other people might be like, oh, it's just so close for home. I can't necessarily share all those things.
It's funny you mentioned like kids. I've heard you mention that before, but it's cool. Like one of our friends from our hometown, they recently gave birth to their first child, and her husband has a podcast called A Dear Amelia, which is like dedicated to her. And I think it's like adorable. It's like it's like scrapbooking, but there's so much more. It's like an interactive experience. It's more than just like video and pictures. It's your thoughts and your personhood in this space and time.
That shit is beautiful. That shit is beautiful.
Well, you both definitely have a much more, maybe mature is the word.
She's about to shit on our opinions.
No. The thing is, I feel like I am so much less prone to being comfortable sharing things in this type of way. I tend to be someone who likes to curate, I guess, often people's understandings of me, because sometimes it's hard for me to trust that people will and I usually take a long time and build these like deep relationships and then feel safe and and it's not that I withhold information, but just that even that personhood, like I mentioned in one of our first episodes where we were talking about that prosthetic arm or robot arm emoji, where it's like me sort of getting over these barriers I had toward like ways of existing on social media and interacting with people on there. So all that to say that I do feel this sort of like itch of like, oh my gosh, like it's weird that some people listening to this, unlike any other time I'd be having these conversations, I won't be able to like revisit topics with them and be like, oh yeah, by the way, 2 weeks later, like my opinion on that's changed, or like, oh, I learned this new piece of information, or oh, like whatever. Whereas you can with like friends. But in a way, I think that's good. And again, it's very humanizing. It goes back to that conversation of like, when did we get this idea, just because the internet exists and Instagram exists and everything, that we have to perfectly represent ourselves at all times, and that we can't evolve and that we can't grow, and that if everyone in our lives doesn't see all the ways that we've changed or grown, that it didn't happen, or that, like you're tied to one thing. So all that to say, I admire your guys' freedom feeling with it, and I feel like it's been good for me and pushing me more toward that.
That's beautiful.
And honestly, like I feel like I'm generally more of the mind of you, Leslie, where I wouldn't say in normal times I'm like particularly open of a person. Also, I don't think anyone that knows me would say that. But I think that's why it's also special to have it with you two, because we have such a there's so much depth to our friendships. So I think it creates a space for that kind of openness, and then it gets captured, and then people that don't know us listen to it. So it's weird, but I don't know. I think that adds a layer of specialty to it.
Well, it's a strangely safe bubble that one of these days soon, I'm sure it's going to be popped, and we're going to realize like, oh, we're talking about things feeling all safe here, and then.
Yo, if you're listening to this and 1 week without explanation, this shit just stops. Text whoever you know, if you know one of us, and be like, so what happened? Who was it? Which one did it? That note, if you single and you pretty, what's up?
This is Kevin.
But to be fair, I think that's a good question, because today's topic, I feel like we're a little anxious about, because it's one of those topics that's really leaning into us being close and having like a humanizing, open, not claiming to have any sort of truth type conversation that hopefully will be coherent. I mean, TBD. But if anyone has listened to any previous episodes or just know us, obviously we're all from the South. That's where we met. We all were raised Christian. One of us, Kevin, still being Christian, but Leslie and I having a bit of a different path. So we thought it'd be really interesting to take today to really walk through what we would call like a deconstruction of our faith, which, as you can imagine, if if you're very religious, right, or even if you're Christian, you like don't call yourself religious. Like if you have a very religious worldview, that process is a long, windy, intense process. So we thought it'd be interesting to unpack this and give, I don't know,
some have like a raw conversation about it. Yeah, like because there's so many podcasts, right? Like the liturgists, or like I think there's one called the Deconstructionists, where I feel like they have it's a little bit more like it's helping other people think through it. It might be educational. It might be, whereas I feel like this conversation is more just going to be like, hey, like listen in on us doing our best to talk about this. Because, we've mentioned how like we haven't really actually tried to have like a really specific in-depth talk just about deconstruction and how that's gone. Because it's hard to talk about.
Yeah.
So buckle
maybe
up.
a good, yeah, maybe a good place to start would be for us to give some context more specifically about where we started from, at least where we were pre-deconstruction. And I guess for context for me, like I grew up very religious. I was actually reflecting on the extent of my religious upbringing, and I feel like you can't really tell if you're so deep in that culture. But I was just thinking through like going to my grandma's and her having like the Left Behind VHS movie. So like watching that sort of, that kind of eschatology that's like super fundamentalist, thinking like there's a literal rapture impending. And I read all 41 of the Left Behind teen series books.
Jesus.
Which may be interesting pieces of science fiction. So I'm curious to go back and look at them again. But that was the upbringing that I came out of. And with that, as I became like a teenager and early adulthood, I very much like the foundation of my worldview, my beliefs, my value system, as I saw it, were rooted in biblical Christianity. And at that time, I wouldn't have called it religious. I would have just said I have like a relationship, right? Like it's not a religion, it's a relationship, like every millennial Christian says. But that was very much my MO. That's how I viewed everything. If you're not Christian, what does that mean? I guess like I would pray regularly, like try and read my Bible as much as I can. Like there's like spiritual disciplines, like fasting, like that stuff wasn't weird to me. Not saying that it's weird to me now, but like that level of biblically rooted discipline permeated every facet of my life, and everything that I did and said and believed. I didn't drink underage, like that kind of shit. That was the person I was.
My upbringing was that my dad moved to the States from Korea when he was 29, specifically to go to seminary after he had tuberculosis, and prayed to Jesus and asked God to heal him and said, if you do, then I'll believe that you're real and I'll serve you. And he did get healed, got his lungs scanned by the doctors, was like 100% unexplainable healing. And so that's why he moved to the States, and then met my mom, who, is from Kansas. And so very much was in like the Bible Belt, like white evangelical Christian, Pentecostal, Assemblies of God, Protestant, everything, space. And so I was raised, and my dad was also a pastor. So when he first moved here, he was a pastor and then joined the army and became an army chaplain, which is like a spiritual counselor basically. And then a chaplain in the army is supposed to meet all of their soldiers' spiritual needs. So, he'll send people of different faiths than he has to different spiritual resources. But of course, him being a Christian, he would directly provide that counseling. So yeah, I was raised, my mom read the Bible to us every single night. It was called Bible Story Time. We loved it. And it's crazy looking back, because like we would read the Bible cover to cover, and it would just like repeat. And it's crazy looking back some of the Old Testament stories that I'm just like, as a little kid, like how did that not register as like insane? Some of the stuff that goes down in the Old Testament. But we did that. We went to church every Sunday. Very often my dad was the preacher or the pastor at whatever church we were going to at that time. So I was a PK, I was a pastor's kid.
The reputations.
Bouncing between. Yeah.
The PK reputation. Those were the crazy ones.
Badass kids, little bad at baby kids.
Which, to be fair, Leslie actually bucks that that caricature because you were not
Yeah.
a PK as
I
I would have.
was pretty straight,
Yeah.
straight edge. Um, yeah, we bounced between English speaking churches and Korean speaking churches as I was growing up. So I kind of had both experiences, which Korean churches are definitely a whole different, especially like Assemblies of God Korean churches, different vibe. Lots of good food after every service. Um, but yeah, so that was and then like Vincent said, I became a young adult. It was really like in college that I took it for myself. I did do what I would have at that time called like, well, I really examined and like tested my faith. Looking back, it was not. um but decided what I believed for myself, and then pretty much up until last year, the end of last year, right prior to my deconstruction, was like the most involved and invested I have ever been in Christianity. It was like I leaned really hard in, which is kind of what then led to my deconstruction because of things I saw and experienced. And when I leaned so hard in, meaning like Vincent mentioned, like spiritual practices. Not that I was perfect at always reading my Bible or praying, but it was very like top of mind, very like a strong belief in the Holy Spirit. My journey involved, getting involved with a church that really emphasized like God's love and like being a vessel of God's love via prophecy, via physical healing. Of course, I believe in, it was easy to believe in physical healing considering my roots and my dad's story. The power of prayer, right, to impact
Speaking in tongues.
situations. Yeah, speaking in tongues for sure. A spiritual dance, like dance worship, all that.
Yeah.
So that's
Good
my
stuff.
background. Yeah.
Ooh.
Good stuff.
Do y'all want me to share my background? I could share my background, but I feel like I'm still Christian, so like, but I can still just explain how I got here.
I think it's a good perspective.
Okay. Yeah, so dad of course came from island Puerto Rico. I think his family was Catholic. My mom came from Korea. I think her family was Buddhist. Mom somehow starts working for a travel agency where she has to learn how to speak English. She gets converted to Christianity. I think somewhere in that travel agency, dad joins the military, meets my mom in Korea on his first tour. Of course, she's Christian by then. He's with the Christian faith, so they get married. And then my mom just like kind of like with Leslie, even though neither of my parents were pastors, my mom just like same thing, reading Bible stories to me, telling me Bible. Like mom is like on the ball of like this is what faith is. And I was like, lady, fuck all of this bullshit. Like these Christians and this Western church can suck my hold. And I was just like, I'm not riding with any of it. And then I actually told my mom, she was trying to get me, I was like 12, and she's like, you should go get baptized next week. They're doing baptisms. And I specifically remember telling her, I'll get baptized after I graduate college. Because this is how like not down with the church I was, but I wanted to like just do it for her. And she was like, after college? Why you want to wait after college? And my brother leans over and goes, because he wants to do all his wild shit in his college years. And then he like, and so
Did your brother lie though?
no, it was real. I was like, I'm gonna do all. Actually, my plan, swear to God, my plan for my whole life, because I like, ironically, as my mom is like telling me all these stories, I have this like consciousness or just this thing in my head where I do have this like reverence for this idea of a higher entity of what she positioned or posited to be God, and I had this like honor and respect and reverence and fear of it, and knowing that you should hold it in an other than category. So I remember telling myself, I'm going to wait till I'm on my death, like as if I could control my death. I'm going to wait till I'm on my deathbed. Then I'm going to accept Jesus Christ, my Lord and Savior at the last minute. So I can wild out and then get
That
saved.
guy on the side of Jesus, pull one of those right at the last minute, sliding in. Yep.
Slided. And then ironically, at the age of 17, right before I graduate high school, I have what I describe as like a radical conversion experience where I'm sitting in this church, and what felt like to me in the moment, the best way I can describe it was, it felt like when people say they hear a voice but like there's no audible voice, it fucking felt like God ripped the roof off of the church, reached in and just started like digging his hand into my heart and like twisting it, and it felt like every word that was coming out of the pastor's mouth was like direct. It felt like someone was reading my diary and was talking direct. It was like I was in a room of like 1,000 people, and it felt like the pastor was speaking directly to me. And so I remember just like bawling I was in a really emotional and traumatic season of my life with shit that was going on, dumb shit I was doing around my neighborhood that got me into like fights and dealing with a bunch of dumb shit I shouldn't have been involved with. So I felt like God speaking to me. I had what I would describe as a powerful conversion experience. It was my like what I felt like was my own faith rather than my mom the whole life trying to shove her faith down my throat that I really wasn't fucking with. And then from there, I got involved with church, but then I really set on a personal journey of like Bible reading, prayer, and really trying to connect with what Western culture and what that church and what Western white evangelicalism posited and frames and positions as this idea of a higher entity that they refer to by the word God, and trying to have a personal relationship by their framework with who they say to be his son and the person of Jesus. So that's kind of my story and where I'm at right now.
Wow, this is beautiful. I feel like we're back in the internship that Kevin and I were in together at the church.
A Christian internship, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's funny you say like you wanted to like wild out and then repent on your deathbed, because it reminds me of all those in the church that I grew up in. They would do every now and then like the heaven or hell plays where the kids would like die horrifically, or like the adults, and like you see them go through like the book of judgment. And there was always the one that was like, I know God, you're real, but I just really want to hang out with my friends. And then they like die and they like try and repent, but it's like too late, and like it's so sad. Love that.
I want to scream.
Love that. I kind of want to watch one on YouTube.
So what led you, or go ahead.
I think we're going to the same place, like the place of
Yeah.
deconstruction.
Yeah.
For me, it's interesting because it wasn't a specific point. And I realized that when we were really involved with the church, I feel like culturally there was a bigger shift happening where even in the church, we were already having conversations of our problems with Christianity as a religion, right? Like, I feel like we are at the age of, like I mentioned, like, this is a relationship, not a religion. There were just like cultural shifts. I don't know. I think it's like our generation, like the internet. I think like the post 9/11 war years. So I think all those cultural pieces of conservatism was evolving with Christianity. So for me in the church, I was already having these conversations like, I don't want some super stuffy, like ritualistic, legalistic religion. Like I want to know like what, like I want to really dive into the Father himself in my relationship. So I was already having these conversations of what exactly is the dogma that I adhere to, and what are the pieces that are just appendages, like cultural appendages. So that was happening when I was a Christian. When I was in an internship for a year with Kevin, leading like Bible studies. And then I went off to college. I was still leading Bible studies, and with InterVarsity, I was kind of involved, but still having these conversations of like, what exactly does all of this, the religion, the Bible, Yahweh, the rituals that are related to it, what does this all mean, and what's like the core piece of it that really matters. So that was a journey I was on since I feel like young adulthood, and then I graduated college and I moved to the heart of Lucifer's lair, Los Angeles, California. So that conversation was just a continuation of what was already happening, but I think there were less reinforcing cultural pieces where I lived. So I was able to really get to the root of what I believed. And that's what set me on, I think, the journey. But again, it wasn't like a hard stop or start. Like it's hard to pinpoint a specific place. Is that the case for you, or is it a bit different in your case?
For me, it was, I think probably there was many things that had like been set up that were, honestly, looking back, I'm like, oh, that was definitely a forerunner to my deconstruction without me even realizing it. And I feel like you've said it's similar to what you're saying, where it's like in my mind, it was actually just digging deeper into my faith and like figuring out what I really believed in and everything. But then looking back, I'm like, ooh, but that is like literally a direct, like what then led to like the moment of the pin being pulled and just being like, wait. And I think that probably some of the things that set me up for that pin being pulled, which I think was essentially like when I moved to Hawaii, and I'll explain that in a second, but it was, one of them was honestly like friendships with people who are queer, which until I was in college, I didn't have any friends that I know of that, you know, that told me or that were out who were queer. But I developed some close friendships in college, and just being honest, you know, like I just feel like especially with our upbringing in the South. And it makes me so sad looking back, the way that I understood queerness and people who are queer, and just such a dehumanizing lens, such a lens of, well, they just don't. It's crazy, crazy looking back for me. That was one of the things, and obviously, what the Bible has to say about that, and the larger whatever, if they're cultural appendages or not, they're very much part of the Christian experience. I think in 90% of cases, the treatment of queer people, and then also just like the Old Testament, some things that we can dive into more if we want when we talk about the actual process of deconstruction. But there were certain things that went down in the Old Testament that I just like could not reconcile with the idea that the God of the Old Testament is the same as Jesus. And the fact that I had actually initiated over the course of probably like 3 years leading up to my deconstruction, I had initiated these really intense conversations with Christian leaders in my life, loved ones, pastors, just leaders, and that it always arrived back at this same thing of like, it's best summed up by one person who responded to me, a very prominent Christian leader in my life and in that community, said, well, Leslie, I literally sat down with them and went through several passages in like Leviticus in particular, and was like, I cannot understand how this is a loving God and how this is the same God, as Jesus. And he was like, well, you can either spend your life wrestling with these questions and like eventually erode away your faith, or you can just choose to believe that God is love and God is who he says he is. And that was really one of the big setups for then the pin being pulled, because it was like, wait, it's kind of almost like the definition of an abusive relationship where they're like, someone's doing something, they're like, no, like, I love you, like, believe that this is love. And like, just believe me, like, choose to make this story true rather than allowing the realities of things to give some sort of rise to assessment. And then I think the last thing, I jotted down some notes. The last thing that set things up was Trump's election, and learning about the Black Lives Matter movement, and seeing the response to that from the Christian community, and not in like oh, I'm better than you because XYZ, but more so just like, again, you always hear that thing whenever there's some big thing that Christians at large are doing, especially in America. I mean, that's my experience, Christians in America. You hear that thing of like, oh, they're just not real Christians, or, oh, they're just not really following Jesus. But it's like, but if most of that population is doing that, who's to say, so that. And then the really the setup was physically moving out of where I had been for, at that point, longer than anywhere else in my life, out of the place where the church that I had joined during college and then came back to after college, leaving that space, having room gave me the room, I think, to manifest a lot of things that had already had so much set up.
What were your initial thoughts to hearing that Christian leaders basically say, in a way, like, stop obsessing over these legitimate questions and just trust? What was your gut reaction? And do you remember like how you like literally responded?
I think how I literally responded was just like, I didn't want to be disrespectful, so I don't think I was like, wow. But I'm pretty sure I was just like, okay. I didn't really know what to say. And like that kind of ended. And this was after this was 2 hours into the conversation. I was like, wow, that's what we arrived at. And the fact, again, that's where the conversation always arrived. Like, I had reached out to so many people wanting to engage about this, not wanting them to give me answers, but like, what do you think as someone who's been in ministry for 20 years or whatever? And I'm like, man, that's the answer. It was just kind of like an incredulity, and also is that how you pronounce it? An incredulity that also that I hadn't prior to this. The fact that I literally had never even thought to question like how the Bible was put together, because it's just like assumed, right? It's like, well, of course, like this religion is like the biggest world religion. Like, yeah, it's all I've ever known. Like, of course the Bible's trustworthy. Of course we know how it was put together. And then I was like, wait a second, like, we're basing our entire understanding of the world and our place in it, let alone anything else, second, third order effects of that, on, and it's not even part of the upbringing to learn about, let alone question, like, our holy text. and then like what's in there. Yeah. Why did you have a moment like that, Vincent? Where you had some sort of like strong reaction to like, and did you also kind of have these sorts of conversations where like as you were starting to question, you would like reach out to people and
Yeah, mine
wrestle?
was harder in that in general. I just do things solo. I feel like a lot of my deconstruction, which unfortunately I think there's a lot of pain in doing it on your own and literally feeling it because you are on your own doing it. But it's interesting because I also felt like I always said when I was Christian that if I believe that the Bible is the inerrant word of God, right? Like in the Christian faith, like the Bible is without fault. It's perfect, right? It's as intended as God intended. Like it's literally His word is the belief. And if that's the case, then I always felt like it could withstand any strong critique and criticism. And I had that in my mind, and I was asking these questions, honestly thinking like, oh, I'd probably end up at some sort of Christian place. But a lot of these questions, again, I was really just kind of tackling on my own. That's when I got really into podcasts and stuff. And I started listening not just to like post-Christian podcasts, but like the bad faith or the bad Christian podcast. So like podcasts that have maybe more what would be called like liberal interpretations or just like different beliefs. But yeah, and I guess to catch up to where you were, like you mentioned, like the election, moving to Hawaii, I had moved to LA right before that election. So I was already pretty deep into this journey. I mean, I think it was significant to the time of my life. So I just graduated college. This is my first time living on my own. So all those anxieties of like, what do I want to do with my life? Like, who am I? Who are the people that I want to surround myself with? All while questioning like the literal fabric of the way I would normally answer these questions. And just kind of going through all those anxieties, I think made it more painful, but I think was good fertile ground to really self-explore every facet of my being and be very honest and open. And again, I didn't think I would land in a place where I wasn't going to be Christian. I just think it just kept slowly unraveling, and honestly seeing people that like before the election, like moving to Los Angeles, there's just a wealth of different experiences that I was interacting with, and some of the more life-giving interactions were not with Christians. There were people that were maybe like very liberal Christians. So my conservative upbringing would say that honestly they're probably not even like really Christians, right? Like kind of like Leslie said, like there's this game that Christians play where anyone that leaves the faith, unless you have, I think, is it like Calvinist, where I think you would think they just were never actually saved. Like that type of thought was very prominent, and it's a game because everyone plays that game. So depending on who you ask, they're the real Christians, and everyone else that disagrees with them or left the faith, like they were never Christian to begin with. But I was meeting those kind of people. I mean, atheists, Muslim people. I was still dancing, so around a lot of queer people. And just seeing some of the life-giving relationships I have with those friends, comparing them to conservative friends or family or people that I'm just acquainted with, it was apparent that there wasn't that strong of a correlation to being Christian and being moral, a good person, having any monopoly on truth. And I think it just became like increasingly apparent. And then it definitely crystallized in a few things, including the Trump election. I was already pretty far gone. I probably wasn't a Christian by that point, even if I didn't claim as such. But to see the discourse and just like the hunger for a Donald Trump type figure and everything that he represented, like if your theology and your worldview makes you sympathetic to that, I can't relate. Like I don't want anything to do with that. That being said, I was still talking to both of you during that time. How did it seem? Again, it was hard. I was also going through some pretty serious mental health things, and I wasn't particularly open about it. And again, I don't think I had the full awareness of what was going on in my mental. But I'm curious, how did it seem from the outside looking in?
Leslie, I'll let you take that. No, don't.
Okay.
No, I'll take it. No, I'll take it. I think I think it might have come up in the text conversation. I can't remember if I provoked it or I asked back and forth if Vincent found a church out
You
there. Vince,
probably, let's be real, Vincent wouldn't have like brought that up out of the
yeah, but I don't think I would have asked. Like, I don't think I ever would have asked Vince, "Are you still like?" It's weird now trying to think of how that conversation came up. So I remember asking about had he been going to churches near Wilmington where he was going to college, and I asked about
Mm.
churches he may have been getting involved with in L.A. And at one point, I think he just like he might have in those, and then thankfully at the time, me and Vince in the group chat we were in with JoJo, just we had very open conversations. Like it was a safe space to say, and I say a lot of wild, un-PC shit that would get us absolutely canceled on this episode if I said it right now. We say
You
it in
would
that
never.
I want to, but I won't. But that text group chat was very much so a safe space where we could do that kind of stuff and say whatever. So I think hopefully at least there was a precedent set for Vince to feel like he could say anything. And so he said, I think he just straight out said at one point, like, I don't think I'm a Christian anymore. Or I'm not a Christian anymore. And so the first impact was like, it was, it's heaviness because like I still hold to I still, what I'll say is like, first and foremost, when it comes to Christianity in the West, 95 to 97% of it, fuck every last one of you Christians and churches in the West, in Australia and Britain, from Kevin Matthew Ortiz in 2020, on my mama, fuck every last one of you Christians, pastors, churches, etc. SMD, TMD. Man, like I just most of the churches and Christians in America. So when Vince told me that, I I was in the middle of me not going to church anyway. I'd walked away from the church. I was very still deep and progressing in my faith and my relationship with Jesus, but in terms of church, I was like, yo, fuck every last one of y'all. This is stupid shit. And I'm not stupid and I'm not a pawn and I'm not an idiot and I can see the bullshit and the poly. Y'all, my cute little jab at churches in America is you're not selling Jesus, you're selling church, and anyone who walks into your building, if they're lucky, they just might happen to catch Jesus. Just because like the vast majority of the shit y'all sell is not Jesus. So like fuck every last one of you. So Vince tells me that and I'm like, shit, it's heavy. And I'm like, fuck, it's a burden. But at the same time, there's an empathy and a compassion because I have my own issues with the church. Um, and then I go like, man, like thankfully I wasn't one of those Christians who like my life, clearly I was walking away from the church. My life wasn't wrapped up in church. And so there was so much me and Vincent already connected on dance, life, culture, college, youth, like the shit that we did just growing up, that we had enough of a relationship that we could throw the whole church shit out the window. And I was still fucking with Vince on such a person, on a human level, that it was like we're still friends. Like I still fuck with this dude. Like he's one of my closest people in the world. Like I'll pick him if someone came to me and said you got to pick your Christian friends or Vince. Let me tell you, Christian friends, y'all are getting thrown down the fucking toilet. But it was still heavy. It was hard. But thankfully, because of who Vince is as a person, I was still allowed a space in his life just to still interact and have a relationship. And it was, I mean, it was difficult, but me and Vince's relationship is still one of the most beautiful things in my life to this day. Like Vince's, I can't think of I mean, yeah, like more than the majority of Christians that I know who I still heavily fuck with. I'm closer to Vince than I am with them and have a more beautiful relationship and safe space with Vince than I do with them.
Well, I love that and love you. Um,
Love you.
to unpack that a bit, like when you say it was heavy, what about it is heavy? I mean, obviously, it's not just that I don't subscribe to different beliefs. Like, what, from your perspective, what's heavy about that necessarily? Especially as someone that wasn't even necessarily super in the physical church at that point.
Yeah, the only and I've never had this happen to me, so this is a very crude and unfair analogy for me to use, but I'll try to use it. It was almost like growing up and finding out your father wasn't your father. You felt like a family member was disconnected from you, and it was like, oh shit, like because I still, even though it's like fuck 99% of Christians, it's still a family. It's in-house issues. These are like I hate you motherfuckers, but y'all are still my family. I'm still gonna ride for y'all if things ever get bad, and y'all are still my like one of my top priorities. So to hear that, like in terms of the big C global grouping of Christians, that Vince came to a place where he was like, nah, I'm not rock. This shit ain't. This is some bullshit. It was like it was like, oh damn, like like almost if you was in a gang and like one of your people left, or if you was hometown friends till 20 and someone left for their whole life and you didn't have internet and faith, you feel like this almost this severance or this tie cut off, and you feel like you lose a part of somebody um out of like this space that you used to be in. Like I don't know, it's such a weird dynamic of like it's almost like a grieving. It's almost like you lost something in somebody. Like if you break up with somebody and like this intimacy y'all once shared, this common shared experience of a dating relationship, y'all, it's now gone, and there's this so it was heavy because of that aspect of it. But then again, thankfully me and Vince had years of friendship that superseded Christianity. And if we didn't have that, I don't know if I was still a young stupid fucking idiot Kevin at 20 years old in the internship, like so brainwashed by Christianity, I don't know if I would have survived that, like Vince telling me that, and I don't know if we would have stayed close and kept talking. So thankfully, like me and Vince had such an ecosystem of a beautiful relationship and friendship that I was like, man, yeah, I agree. Fuck them too. Like, me and you still down. But it still very much so felt like almost like a breakup, where it's like, man, we lost like to me on my worldview, it was like we lost a family. I feel like I lost a brother. I feel like I lost someone. Like there's this great intimacy that you can share amongst, man, whatever group you're a part of. Like if you build this sort of alliance with a group of people who hold a worldview and they just suddenly like shift the worldview, it's like, yeah, because I there's intimacies of my heart that, yeah, only come out in Christianity and with other Christians. Because you know, like Leslie, that you guys know, there's certain languages and certain hopes and aspirations and burdens you put onto the idea of God. And so you share your hurts and your pains and your angers in the context of being in relationship with God, with other believers, and you can share it in a certain way. And so to lose that with somebody, it hurts. But again, me and Vince were closer to be able to survive that, thankfully.
No, I think that's something too that I still have anxieties about when I like talk about, even people that know, like my parents, they know I don't believe, but like even having the conversation, I feel bad because I know I'm putting them in a place to make those kind of considerations of like me leaving the church. I mean, like in like a very simplistic way, like I feel like I'm reminding them that I'm going to hell. Obviously, I don't believe that. So to me, to me, these conversations are fine to have in a vacuum, but like I know that what they're hearing and thinking is in line with that. That makes me more nervous to have these conversations because for them, like my soul's at stake. Me, I'm just having like a nice conversation over brunch.
Vince is like, no coffee today. I got tea today. Like,
Yeah.
And they're like, we're gonna gather our friends and pray for.
They're trying to convert me. Yeah. And I'm sympathetic to that, right? Like especially people I care about. Like I'm not trying to provide some sort of angst or give them cause to be concerned about me. Like I don't want that, but that's the. Yeah.
So to cap, I want to touch on this a little bit because you guys already touched on the human, I think, experience. Well, Vince touched on it. Leslie, I don't think you really touched on it because one of the questions that Vince already asked that I wanted to ask you guys was the anxieties and the apprehensions and the heaviness and the burden of like, I'm going through this very serious POV shift. And I have loved ones who I know the heaviness. So Leslie, what was that like to like go through this and have to like wrestle with these ideas as a mature young adult in this world and having to become your own person, but knowing you have a pastor father and like loved ones who care for you and you're in ministry with them that you're going to have to like, depending on how much you want to share it, like with them, because you're involved with the church, you're going to have to tell them, hey, this is where I'm at in life. Like, what's that anxiety? Like, what's that emotional burden like?
Man, I just feel like there are so many pathways that this conversation could take. Like I just wish we could do like a 20 installment. But I'll answer that question by kind of also answering by also answering Vincent's question because I think it ties in about how we reacted when he shared.
Yeah.
And I'm pretty sure me and Vincent like talked about it a couple like over like it kind of did come like it would come up in our conversations like on Skype, and I'm pretty sure it is because I like asked about it, and that's just kind of how I am. Like anybody who knows me, like I really always, I don't know, like I just am that way. I don't know what you would call it, but yeah. So
a good friend, a good communicator.
Yeah.
Things that I lack, but yes.
No. I think that in part like being Vincent's close friend and close friendship with him as he went through it, and even though we didn't talk so deeply into it, and partly I think because I sensed like, and maybe this was wrong, Vincent, but I didn't sense a super strong desire from you for me to like try and like deep like start asking you so many, because I think you need, I don't know, maybe I should have. But with one of my closest, longest friends going through this process and me still being a very committed Christian, it made me realize, yeah, just the way that Christians do view people who are not Christian. I had a problem with that. Like my own reaction, I was like, this is not right. Because it is this reaction of like, okay, this person is like not walking in the truth. Yeah, they're going to hell, like XYZ. And I was like, ooh, none of this is ringing true. You know, but I was so I'm pretty sure like it was weird because I didn't even know what to say. Sometimes I felt like I was being a bad Christian because I said how I truly felt, which is like, you know, like I remember asking Vincent at different points how you felt, and you would be like, well, I feel really free, or like during some of the good parts, right? Like you'd be like, I actually feel good. And, you know, I remember like my programmatic reaction being like, ooh, this isn't good that he feels free. But my actual true being like, I think I'm so happy and like I'm so excited for him and like, you know, da da da. So that really would have been the beginning. That was like way before. That was several years ago when I was still very much a Christian. And what I realized, kind of like what you mentioned, Kevin, with having friends who are not Christian, and and Vincent mentioning all his friends who weren't Christian and experiencing their fullness of being in life. You know, my best friend is not a Christian. And I remember early in our friendship, I was like, you know, I just remember having some moment of inspiration, what I would have called the Holy Spirit, and really laying out like what I really believed and how just like I loved her so much. Like I 100% respect what she believes, but I hope someday like that if I'm right about this being the truth, I hope that she gets to experience it. And I remember her just being like, Leslie, I'm never going to be a Christian. And I remember being like, okay. And she is literally the person I'm closest to in this world. And that too, where, oh man, I had a good string that I was going to tie it up with. But basically, by the time that it came for me to have reached a point where I was deconstructing, it was like I'd already sort of done so much. I guess empathizing would be the word, or something, or really putting, because when I care about someone, like I really try to like not just listen to them, but like kind of go into their, like as much as I can, understand things from their perspective. And so I'd already done that so much with some of my closest friends and then just other people in my life that I almost felt it was heavy, but I was just kind of like, I guess, very straightforward, like with the people who needed to know. I just kind of like said it and was like, if anything, I've had dealt with some self-hatred and really negative feelings leading up to it. Like I look back at my journals leading up to when I finally was like, wait, I don't believe this anymore. And I literally like wrote a word cloud about myself, and it was horrible. Like it's very sad to like, it was horrible. All the things I thought about myself. And I think that was part of it too, is because I was reaching that point of such extreme cognitive dissonance where I was trying so hard to make who I am, how I am, my worldview, which I didn't even have words for, but knew deep down, like I could feel those resonances in all these different situations. I was trying so hard to make that match Christianity and just accepting that, like, I'm not a Christian. You know, like, I remember even in so many spaces, I've never been one of those people who had like a Bible verse in my bio, who like really was loud about my faith on social media, even though I was so involved in personal context. I was a youth leader. I was on the worship team. I poured so much time. And it was because I was like, honestly, for someone who doesn't know me, doesn't have context of how I live out my faith, I don't want them to know I'm a Christian until they actually meet me and see how I practice it. Because I don't really agree with like most of what people would think of, you know, and it had been that way for a while. That's being totally honest. And even realizing that, where it's like, I'm trying to enact this story that I've been told about myself and about the world so hard. And I'll wrap it up with this. Sorry, a long rambling answer, but I had this visualization of it. Yeah, I was trying to put it into words last night, and I had this visualization of like, if you look at life and truth and exploration of the mind, exploration of this existence that we're blessed to have, as like a series of like little things shaped like this. So say you're like building a molecule or something, and there's like red and yellow and blue,
like a V shape, correct? To like explain it.
Yeah. Oh, or a peace sign. So if you have red, yellow, and blue, and you think about just that visual, and that's part of like exploring truth, exploring this existence,
so there's so much room for possibility of the interactions where the colors hit and in between colors and all these things. But it was like Christianity over time, me trying constantly without even realizing it. Each time I learned something new, each time I sort of grew new synapses in my brain, developed new opinions, I was always forced to plug it back into this structure that was so limited. Like,
Yeah.
and it was essentially like all the little pieces, I was still growing, but they were all, there was like this lens that turned them all the same color. So I couldn't even see the richness and the vibrancy and the interactions of colors. And, you know, I remember writing also, this is before I even realized I was on the road of deconstruction. I remember writing like, my brain feels, I feel like I've lost my critical thinking. Like I wrote that down. I was like, I feel like I've reached my mind's limit, and I'm so frustrated because I remember growing up, I loved learning. Like I've mentioned this before. I didn't mind having the Korean dad pressure of all A's because I loved school. Like, and I knew it wasn't perfect, but every chance to like absorb and learn and like in all these different ways I loved. And I was so frustrated. I was like, have I just gotten stupid? Like, why is my mind, why does it feel so limited? And I think honestly, a big part of it was just without even knowing I had such a rigid construction through which I was pushing stuff instead of just letting the stuff come at me and meaning arising from that without like applying a structure to it, you know, the schema.
Yeah, that's real. That's so real.
I don't even know if I can go after that. That was so well articulated and definitely resonates a lot with me. And so a lot of my deconstruction was very emotional and like more in the realm of my feelings, my relationships, and what would be like big picture philosophy of life and what does life mean to me. My construction, which we won't get too deep, at least for this conversation, I think had a more logical flow because at that point I had done all the crying, the hard stuff. And it's interesting to construct from that place because I realized similarly, I've also not as good a student as Leslie, but I've also been someone that has definitely enjoyed learning growing up and enjoying experiencing things, enjoyed experiencing like art and culture like significantly. Like it resonates super heavy with me. And I realized that my perception of these things were very muted and limited because I was constantly trying to reconcile this. The moment that I saw anything that was different or uncomfortable or challenged, the posture wasn't to pause and get a further understanding. The posture was to immediately start to reconcile and say, okay, so what does this mean?
Yes.
How does this fit in the context of this meta narrative that I subscribe to?
Exactly.
And not this meta narrative, my specific interpretation in this point in time of a meta narrative that I subscribe to, and constantly trying to reconcile that with everything, which is so limiting. And I think that's what becomes obvious in relationships and life experiences, because especially like both of us leaving where we fostered this worldview, there's an increasing frequency and an amount of things that are incoming that are challenging this and challenging these things, which I think kind of goes into where I am now, where I feel like my love for knowledge and experience and people is so much stronger and richer now. Like I feel so much more free, which is exciting to me because I feel like, and this is not a condemnation. I don't want to do this every podcast. Clearly, like a lot of my good friends are Christian. And if we get to a conversation about how I view religion today, like it's not universally bad. I do have some strong critique, but it's not all bad. But that being said, I think it's telling and true that a lot of people with the types of interpretations that are prominent today, at least in the place I grew up, their ability to understand people and life is limited. And I'm not calling anyone dumb or ignorant, but truly because they are stuck trying to reconcile anything that makes them uncomfortable or is unfamiliar with their, again, that interpretation, which is freeing to not have to do anymore.
And it's literally said in the Bible, like, you know, it talks about the folly of people who fall in love with knowledge. Like, don't be swayed by people who just talk about empty. And it, you know, it's just crazy. It's like, man, it's literally there. And of course, you see the manifestations like in the broader culture. Like, you wouldn't call it that when you're part of that culture, but there is a very emphasis on
stick around Christians, and you're told it's because they'll help build up your faith. But the other effect is you're not exposed to other viewpoints. You're not exposed to other ways of approaching meaning making and truth seeking. So, but I do want to ask, I know we're kind of this episode, I want to ask this now. And yeah, you mentioned how a lot of your deconstruction was emotional. So before we move toward the end of it being talking a bit about our construction, like I was going to ask about that when we were talking about the actual process, where it's like, I feel like there are so many lenses you can squeeze deconstruction through, right? Like you can have a historical lens, you can have a more like emotional, just grappling with like the spiritual truths that you have taken from the Bible and testing those. You can have XYZ social issues, you know. So for you, you're saying like, what can you name one or two of the biggest like things that you were like, yeah, I just can't, this is part of what makes me know like I can't believe this? Because I feel like we talked a little bit in
That's a good question. That's a really good question.
When I say, this may or may not answer, and feel free to push me if it doesn't, but I guess what I mean is I realize in the context, in retrospect, and understanding how I constructed, which was more, I started reading a lot more, but which was more in history and science, like the sciences, right? Archaeology, anthropology, maybe like cosmology. But like all these different things that I don't think I would have even entertained exploring of, because I didn't think it was needed, or you're just not encouraged to do that for what I would say is obvious reasons if you're deep in the Christian faith, because it brings up some very uncomfortable questions. So those type of things were not as much relevant to my deconstruction. For me, emotional, meaning that it was a lot of, I don't know, just seeing things in Christians that I just couldn't vibe with. Like there's family members who, for all the love that they will claim to represent, all the biblical love, like hearing some of the things that they would say, even about, like, to give an idea for how conservative some of my family is, like even just about people's appearances, right? Like I remember one time specifically, and this actually happened a little bit deeper in the experience, but it really stuck out because it was so obvious how much it didn't gel with me. It never did, but especially now, is hearing like one of my older family members just start talking shit about this person at Barbecue Hut. Shout out to the Barbecue Hut in Fayetteville. Slaps, the best North Carolina pulled pork barbecue. Yeah. But like they came in and they had like a mohawk with like some really off color, and my older family member was like, what is going on over there? And they turn around, they're like wearing like a Walmart greeter shirt, and they're like, oh, typical. And I was like, what? Like everything in you would be like, let's unpack this here. Like what do you mean by that? And stuff like that just so viscerally just repulsed me in a way where I almost felt like Christianity was stopping me from being a truly good person and making me have to harden some of my natural inclinations to be very empathetic. Like I would say my personality is actually pretty nice, and I felt like that culture was making me harden certain edges of it. Being around that type.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Why did that make you leave Christianity as a whole, as opposed to just re-upping your faith and becoming what you called, you know, like were you like basically like, well, at a certain point, what's the point if you have to do so many gymnastics to like call it Christian? Was it that, or? I
think that's what it came down to, because like so many. Just everything, like the way that the church operates, like the way that we relate to people, the way that they treat different, like even social issues. Like if I disagree with all these things, at some point, I'm not a Christian. I think that's why it's hard to give specific points, because I would have probably called myself maybe Christian when at that point I really wasn't. Like I'd rejected so many different things of the culture that it didn't even make sense to call myself Christian. But I was holding on to that title because in my mind there was still some sort of biblical dogma that I still adhered to. But when you reject the culture in its entirety, their positions don't line up with you. The people you don't feel like are the beacons of love, joy, peace, and hope like they claim to be. all you're left with is just believing like this much of the Bible, which at that point you're not Christian because you're saying that it's not the inerrant word of God.
Right.
And then that's when I think I lean into more of these logical exercises of like, oh, well, at this point, let's explore what's left. And it's like, oh, well, when you're not anchored in a pre-assumed narrative of Jesus being real and him being the way, the truth, and the light, things start to, in my opinion, a lot of these things, as you question, really fall apart like very easily and very apparently. And I think that's when I got to the place of not claiming to be Christian. Did that answer your question?
Maybe if you just take a few more minutes and explain what you mean by many of these things fall apart easily. Like, what's one that fell apart for you? Just because I think it's juicy. You know, like, I hear what you're saying 100%, but I feel like someone listening could be like, well, but it's still like you're talking a lot about Christian culture. So, like, what made you not pursue, like, well, let me just see it? You know, like, we have some friends who actually then converted to Eastern Orthodoxy, which I hadn't even known existed. You know, and in context of like, oh, wait a second, like the Protestant Christianity, a lot of Americans practice. I don't know if it's the majority or not, but like, isn't even like Eastern Orthodoxy is a lot closer to the religion that Jesus birthed. So why, what fell apart for you to where it wasn't just like the Christian culture that you were part of?
I'm trying to think of a solid example, but broadly speaking, and I'll keep seeking some more solids. I would say, and this might be controversial to a Christian, but I would say that if you show me a person that subscribes to Christianity,
well, here we have one. So
the bulk of their religious experience is cultural. They would say that they can extract it from their faith. I don't think that that's the case. So any implication on what it means for me, especially again at this time in my life, like what it means like job wise, like what I want to do with my career, friends wise, like who do I want to surround myself with, and the things that we do when we're together, even like love, like what kind of woman we talked about in the last podcast, my mom wanting like a God-fearing woman, all of these things and all these pieces of the faith to me are all cultural. They're all just your interpretation, really inspired by the time and space that you occupy to this religious text. And all the theology that you can ruminate over is still your trying to reconcile your lived experience with that text and whatever that interpretation is. So for me, when I was deconstructing the cultural pieces, the thought of me turning like, and my opinion, the thought of me going to a different interpretation of Christianity would to me be me not being honest with completely deconstructing the cultural pieces. So I feel like I really gave myself space to deconstruct everything, not knowing that that literally meant everything, not just what I would have called at that time cultural appendages. I think they're all heavily inspired by culture. And maybe when I started constructing, maybe I still had a little bit of dogma in me, but again, like when I started constructing, reading history, like people study religiosity. Like these aren't topics that don't get touched. Like despite what I think my conception was before, it just provided a lot of big picture perspective, where I felt more confident than to just throw out the label of Christian. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I think, and I also want to create space for Kevin to answer. I do. It actually brings up a really interesting thing that I want to dive into because I'm just really enjoying this conversation. I'm going to keep pushing it as long as it flows.
Fuck it, we have a 2-hour episode. We can do it.
Maybe I can answer, and then Kevin, if you want to respond, because you'll have both of our perspectives to respond. I'd be really curious to hear. I also realized, you remember when we were like in elementary school and you'd be like playing basketball and it'd be like, oh, skins versus shirts or something like this? This episode, inadvertently, since I got this hat, it's hats versus not hats in this episode today.
Intense.
No.
Gang.
But so what Vincent's point brings up for me is, I think, a divergence we had in both our initial experiences with Christianity and then subsequent when we got like more serious about it, which is, I actually don't know that I would say like the cultural piece. I just feel like, again, I don't know where in that lens, Vincent, you would put like my dad's experience or like any miraculous. I don't know where you'd put like miracles and like prophecy, which I don't any longer believe were from, you know, the God of the Bible, but like I've had enough of those experiences, and unless my dad is just a completely crazy liar, which I know he's not, like I know he got healed, I know there's no explanation, and it might be one of those things where like science in its essence is not anti science leaves rooms for unexplainables. That's like the bedrock of it, right? It's like exploring and questioning and so to me those things are incongruent with reality and mean that there has to be necessarily like a higher being and how we've decided like what that means. But yeah, like for me, a few of the like really big things were, so like we were talking about hell, right? And like I reached this point where I know Vincent mentioned, so you said like, well, if that's what being a Christian is, like I don't want any part of it. And for me, I remember reaching this point where I was just examining, yeah, okay, so first off, if you if my best friend, if all these other beautiful people in my life, they're going to hell because they don't believe in this person, like that was part of it where I was like, I don't really want part of that. But then also even looking again in the Old Testament, again, I had swept into this vein of Christianity that so emphasized Jesus and the New Testament, which yeah, Jesus is the one who turned it into Christianity, right, instead of Judaism. But it says that the Old Testament is part of the story and part of God's plan and what brought about Jesus. And if you look back, I had honestly not spent a lot of time in the Old Testament prior, since I had become like a young adult. And then I was actually like teaching it to my youth peeps because I was like, you know, guys, like it's really important we like understand our faith and da da da. And we were literally going through like Leviticus and some of the stuff, you know, I pulled out a few examples, but like there's somebody who's caught gathering wood on the Sabbath and they don't know what to do and they ask God, and God's like, well, take him out of the camp, put your hands on his head and stone him. And there's so many priests, if their daughter goes into prostitution, they're literally told to burn their daughters to death. And I was just like, not even like, okay, this Old Testament God is so angry and bad, which yeah, but like I was like, if that is the forerunner that this God chose to set up for Jesus, like, and also if those people, if someone who was living in the Old Testament went to hell, eternal condemnation, because he gathered firewood on Sunday, and I'm over here able to live my life however the hell I want, and then if I decide at the end of it to like accept Jesus into my heart, then I'm going to heaven, you know, because like we preach grace, right? And like we preach, I was like, I don't want to go to heaven, like that is insane. And like even someone who is a Christian and then falls away, like I was like, ew, wait a second. And I remember having conversations again with people about this, and some people in my life don't necessarily believe that hell is real and are like, well, but I actually think maybe like there's an in-between lake of fire, and then at the final judgment they get to die, and instead of having to be like tortured forever. And like I also remember what was the other thing? Oh, some people are like, well, I think that the people in the Old Testament did go to heaven and God was actually just mercy killing them so that they'd stop sinning and not infect the rest, but they still got to go to heaven. And they base it off of like one obscure verse in the New Testament. And it's like, again, it's that same thing of like forcing yourself so hard to like make things as like, well,
Yeah,
I mean, this is
that's
what love
real.
must be. And I can't see how this is loving at all. So like, I'm just going to try. And so for me, I guess it actually is kind of similar to what Vincent is saying, but I wouldn't have framed it as necessarily just like, well, the culture is, it's also just like what's in the Bible. Yeah. And then not even getting into the conversation of how the Bible was canonized and how the people who decided what ended up in the Bible we now hold today as the sacred text. And it's like, who were they? Like, wasn't it all just like even men? Even just from that lens, there wasn't a
And even
single
then,
woman
like
involved.
even then, like this conversation, like yeah, totally. I think these thoughts happened to me mid deconstruction. Where I am now, like even hearing this,
Yeah.
that's like it's an exhausting exercise. Not like literally us having this conversation, but this kind of stuff is exhausting because even now, our critiques are still rooted in the Bible and reconciling to some form of coherence and truth that we believe. without even being willing to step outside of the Bible, and look at it as like a historical piece of text, and what all the implications of that are, right? Like who went into actually writing it, who sanctioned like what should be in the Bible, and not just like who sanctioned it, but like what. And this kind of gets back to, and honestly, this probably makes sense for, like, yeah, it's probably shades how I perceive the world now. Like what was going on in history, who is in power, why did these ideas proliferate? I think there's a lot of interesting work on some of these historical figures, and with our modern understanding of the continuum that is mental health, some of these people that were like prophets and such, like what are some things that we didn't understand that could impact what they were saying, what they were preaching? All of these things I think are interesting, but again, we at least in this space are so conditioned to center it in the context of just the Bible and trying to reconcile just what this text says to make sense, which maybe speaks to something else that I think was starting to become apparent, was that I was starting to hit these life anxieties and introspective topics that were way more complex and much larger than the versions that I had been given in the Christian church, if that makes sense. Like a lot of like, what does it mean to be a good person? Like what is good? And it's easy to get what I would say is kind of like a reductive, like biblical answer to that, right? Like God is love, like it's the opposite of sin. But these concepts aren't unique to the Bible. They pop up in a lot of different religions. And even that itself to me is limiting, right? There's just like bigger considerations that are exciting to think about now because they're, I don't know, more terrain is unlocked. But I think that was frustrating to me to see all these conversations. Just you're like, well, read the Bible. Like everything points back to God, which I understand if that's your belief in your dogma. But on the other side of it, it's like it's like frustrating. Like no. Like let's think bigger here. Like let's zoom out. Let's have a bigger respect for truth while having the humility to know that we're still finite beings, and truth in itself, like at some point there's limitations, but like it's bigger than just the Bible. Like we can think a little bit harder about this.
And for anyone out there listening who might be like on the verge of deconstructing or thinking about it, or not at all, but if you are, I feel like the marker for me, I don't know if it's like this for you, Vincent, but it's exactly what you're saying, where to me, what made me understand, oh, this is something different. This is not just like me questioning my faith or like wrestling with my faith, so to speak, which again, there were like those forerunner things that were happening. But it was exactly what you're saying of this feeling of like, oh, this is the first time. I don't even know exactly how it happened. I was suddenly able to to examine it outside of the perspective of in context of itself. Which is what you're saying, right? Like, that's the nature of deconstruction. You have to be able to examine it, but not from the inside looking around you and being like, this is the structure I am. But like go out and be like, oh, this is one little structure, like amidst this vast world. And like, yeah.
Ooh. Kevin, I'm curious what your thoughts are, but first I'm curious, like, genuinely, how does hearing this stuff make you feel? If you don't mind sharing.
No, yeah. Let me say this. Anyone who's a Christian who is hearing what Vince and Leslie are saying, regardless of what your feelings and emotions are towards what they're saying, I would encourage you to adopt a mentality of Vince and Leslie very likely know something.
Are going to hell.
No.
Okay, sorry. Just understand, don't worry. They're going to hell, so you have to be scared of their thoughts. They won't lead you astray. Okay, sorry.
These two are the ones that Jesus warned you about in Revelation. Love that.
Holy shit.
Sorry, Kevin. Couldn't resist.
Oh shit. Vince and Leslie quite possibly understand and know something that you don't. Even me as the Christian, I sit here and this is going to sound so arrogant. I sit here as a Christian knowing that I can say things to Christians about their Bible that will fuck up your whole worldview. Leslie named 1 or 2 examples of Leviticus where it's very uncomfortable. I can name multiple instances in your scriptures that will. I can talk about how your Bible writers use pagan poetry to construct their scriptures. I can talk about multiple things where at one point the Bible says that Satan incited King David to do something, and the very next book giving the same account says God incited David to do something. So what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to encourage humility. I'm trying to encourage anyone who's Christian, who's listening, who wants to be combative or argumentative, jump in the comment section or stand on their high horse or in their ivory tower and, oh, these poor souls who just don't know. Listen to what they said about you, me, all of us Christians live in a construct, in a confinement of a worldview that they have stepped outside of. When you talk to them or you talk to anyone else who's not a Christian, they no longer operate by your rules and your vocabulary and your vernaculars. Don't speak to them in this condescending prodigal son, daughter verbiage. Understand that they live in a much more elevated, intellectual, cerebral worldview, and it's very possible
I wouldn't say
that
elevated.
in regards to your faith, they know something.
Yeah. Debatable, but thank you.
They know
That's very
something. They know something you don't. But to your question was kind of like how I feel hearing all of what you guys are saying, right? It's man, I wish more Christians. Y'all are gonna think there Christians who hear this are gonna think I'm crazy. I wish it's heavy. It is heavy. It is heavy, and it's almost like it's a grief on my soul, but in a good way. But I look at you guys as incredibly responsible, as intellectually, cerebrally responsible, because I wish every Christian would do this, would be forced to do this in a college class, in churches. I feel like what you guys did is there's this verse in the Bible where it says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind and strength." And I feel like the majority of Christians violate. I think that word is right, incredulously. I feel like most Christians egregiously violate that mind part. And I think in honor of your guys' mind and soul and spirit and intellect and yeah, your mind, I feel like you guys honor your mind in its space and its our human God, what I call our God-given capacity, but a born innate, whether you believe in God or not, a born innate capacity of any human being to exercise to its utmost capacity, a mental faculty and facility to explore, to challenge, to buck against, to prove that something has to be immovable. I feel like you guys have honored that facility far further than the vast majority of Christians. So hearing what you guys are saying, of course, on one end it's heavy, but the artist side, even the God-fearing side of me, the artist side of me, the Christian side of me, the side of me that's very unorthodox in how I approach my faith with God, that most people would just look at and be like, this is a fucking circus act. What is this kid? This kid is a heretic. That side of me looks at you guys and there's so much beauty. There's so much depth. There's so much wonder and awe. And there's like this sense of like, oh my God, how fucking refreshing. Like when Kanye West got saved, I was furious because I knew he was getting saved, like Vincent, in a culture, in a context of Christianity that was going to send him that was whether he was going directly into Jesus or not, whether I believe that or not is a whole different story. I knew he was going to be formed and shaped by the culture of Western Christianity and their lingo and their Christianese and all this horse shit that I fucking hate. So to hear you guys on this side of the spectrum where deconstruction happened, it feels like I've been living in a swamp. Like every time I got to get around Christians, I'm in this muggy swamp where no fresh water ever comes in, and it's the mire and the muck, and it's muggy and the water's unclear, and it's like seaweed, and it's just fucking dirt. And then I get to hop in this fresh pool with you guys, this cold, refreshing pool where it's like, oh God, like mentally they get it. Like they're just on this plane of thought, this frequency and this wavelength of thought that feels so refreshing and beautiful. And they're not fucking brainwashed, and they're not fucking minions, and they're not pawns, and they're not idiots. They're not, Vince and Leslie are not stupid. Again, a key characteristic of humility is to assume the person you're talking. The key characteristic of humility is to assume the person you're talking to knows something you don't. And so for me, who isn't so fragile in my faith system as to hear what you guys are saying, and for it to grieve me, but to not be so fragile that it like sends me pouty or makes me uncomfortable or unable to talk, or no, it makes me go, all right, take my inhibitions about faith aside. This shit is beautiful. Nobody does this. Nobody does this. Most people don't do this about their culturalisms, let alone their faith, about why my parents want, like we talked about last episode, to marry a certain person of a certain career or of a certain skin color, of a certain. Most people don't do this in any aspect of their life. Why am I going to college? Because everyone growing up told me to go to college and I never questioned. Why am I working this career? Because it's acceptable within my community to work this career. It's unacceptable. They did something that we tell people to do all the time, is to be your own person. Don't become something society forms you into. Be brave, be bold, adventure, dare to believe, dare to ask, dare to challenge things, and dare to not just fall into the confines of what society would want to form you and shape you and fit you into. So honestly, as an artist and as a believer, as a person of faith, as a Christian, I hear what you guys are saying. And although a part of me does feel grief to some sense, another part of me, maybe an equal part of me, if not a greater part of me, goes, it's what beauty, what wonder, what awe, what beautiful minds that I could draw so much from and breathe fresh air from and jump into the pools of refreshingness and soak in and be able to be revitalized and rejuvenated from.
That's so sweet, Kevin. And sweet is a very asinine word. Like, that's not the right word, but like, thank you so much. That's so sweet. And I will say, I think I am probably still brainwashed in lots of ways. I think we all are, right? Like anyone who just grows up in the world, like, and I always want to figure those things out. But yeah, it's exciting, right? When you do. And I want to tag on real quick to what you kept saying, like beautiful and refreshing. And I think this is just interesting. I've never thought of it until you just said it, or I've never put it into words in my head. But I think so many Christians love the core of what a lot of Vincent and I said was essentially like just being willing to question and wanting more and being excited and playful and wonder-filled about all that there is in the world to understand. And I think you experienced this too, Vincent. Like when I was a Christian and when I wasn't far enough along to be so cognitively dissonant that I could actually sort of like merge it, where it's like, yeah, I'm a Christian, I love Jesus, and this is why I'm so like wonder-filled and da-da-da, and I can apply these beautiful interpretations of scripture and I can lead youth in this very unique, refreshing way. And, I would hear like, wow, you're just like, and I was like a leader. I constantly got put in positions of leadership. I constantly got held up an example, da 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 da. And I feel like that happened to Vincent too. And it's just so interesting how I think Christians do love this thing. But then when it comes down to it, suddenly gets cut off. If then it's like, but actually I realized like all these things have led to me being this way, and it's not Jesus, it's not the faith. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, well, they were just, oh, and it literally viscerally happened to me with my old church, right? Where when I came up and I was like, just briefly, the old church I was part of after I'd moved, speaking back to them because I had been involved for so long, I had such an influence, I had been a leader, I'd been put in positions of power, I'd been in, and I was like, guys, like I brought this up 2 years ago, you guys are silent on the issue of racism, and it's wrong, and took a lot of time, and I literally was like excommunicated and painted as like being used by the devil and had gotten so liberal, and it was just like, you loved all of these things about me until it hit something that you feel is uncomfortable and threatening to your faith structure, which in itself, it's like, wow, that's threatening. Like, yeah, again, don't want a part of that. That's threatening to like to recognize if there's an issue in an all-white congregation, if you're not willing to speak up about racism and condemn it and recognize
I think
again,
that's
question.
I think that's with respect, I do think that there's something to that, like in any sort of environment where you're being conditioned to think something, to believe something, is that they give you a sandbox of an area where you can feel like you have autonomy and you feel like you can self-explore, but it's only that small sanctioned space, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like that space is actually crucial in keeping people feeling like, oh no, like especially as young millennial Christians, again, I think a lot largely informed by the world that we grew up in, like, no, we will question dogma, religion, and rituals. That's what we do. It's cliche to say at this point. So I think it's notable that it's possible to provide space for that to happen while making sure that exploration doesn't start to hit into pillars that are not supposed to be questioned. And I'll also say too, kind of what Kevin was saying. I think you two are unique in that I was more open about this than I was with most people. So, which for a Christian, this might not sound like a good thing, but I'm saying it's a good thing, in that I feel like you guys are both a big part of who I constructed my being, my identity, my worldview, and that really matters a lot. But one thing that does trigger me that Kevin kind of brought up is when Christians do this, like Leslie brought up too, right? Like the way you were excommunicated, like you went and got liberal. There's this narrative, and it honestly triggers me, where it's like, oh, I went to college, oh, I went to liberal California, and like that's what corrupted me from the church. First of all,
amen.
First of all, no, but this comes up a lot, and I feel like and some of it might just be my own insecurity, and I'm trying to overcompensate. But I feel like I have to do the work of being like, no, this was a thoughtful exercise for me. Like, this wasn't, when I was deconstructing. Yes, I was around a lot of different people, but my close friends were all still Christian. And a lot of what I believe, my worldview, my priorities, it's self-driven because I was doing it on my own, literally, but I felt incredibly alone while I was doing it. And there's a lot of mental health implications of that. Like, it was not a fun experience in the slightest. This wasn't me like trying to be cool with the in crowd and like liberal Los Angeles, which in itself is like nonsensical if you actually like live here, like that aside. But that kind of logic, and it's so infantilizing, but I still see it all the time. It still comes up when people interact with me that know that I'm at least more liberal, or if they know explicitly that I'm not Christian. And if I can make any plea to, if there are Christians listening, like, take me, don't do that to me. Like, because I enjoy talking about these things, like even with Christians, like it's heavy, but it is enjoyable for me. It's like something that's been top of mind for years, but there's this reoccurring theme of like, oh, well, you went and got liberal now and got corrupted, and I can't stand.
And literally brainwashed, right? Like, that language gets you. It's funny that we're talking. It's like, you got brainwashed. Yeah, and it's like,
amen, brother.
Ooh, when I tell you it triggers me, it just triggers the shit.
No, let me say this. If you're a Christian and a non-Christian affords you the privilege and the luxury to have that conversation with them, stop yourself, take a breath, and go, the point of this conversation, if nothing else, should be for me to listen and to learn and to ask questions that are of genuine curiosity, not to accomplish an agenda, not to accomplish a motive. I just want to hear. This is a human being I'm talking to, not a fucking game with a boss level final stage that I have to beat. I'm talking to a human being, and if I'm fortunate enough, this human being will open more and more parts of their heart to let me see what it's like to be a human in their shoes. So as Christians, outside of Leslie and Vince, with anyone who's not Christian, if someone affords you that luxury of their mind, the space of their heart, do not dishonor it by trying to accomplish your agenda. Do not spit on it by trying to accomplish by some ulterior motive. You just want to make your voice heard. Actively listen more than you speak. Actually measure how much you're speaking, how many words you're saying. Let them speak more. And if anything, behave like someone who's like an interviewer or a journalist, and just ask questions neutrally for the sake of asking questions to try to inspire more conversation. But leave your fucking agendas at the door and honor them as a human being, and stop looking them as a prize to be won for your fucking agendas.
You know, deconstruction also involves construction, as opposed to just walking away from the faith. Deconstruction also implies, like, you know, you're critically examining your faith, but then like, well, what do you believe? So what are some things you've arrived at, Vincent, or just things that have informed your constructive period, which you already kind of talked about, but is there any little gems you want to like highlight? Or it's a similar question, but Kevin brought up like really refreshing things that have come after deconstruction, which again could be part of the construction.
Ooh, that's hard. I mean, the one that's top of mind, I don't know if this is like in itself special, but the one that comes to mind first that I kind of alluded to was like religiosity as something to be studied and to understand and critique, which is interesting because again, at least for me in my lived experience as a Christian, you feel like you have these like eternal truths that science like can't or does poorly tries to attempt to answer, and it's like a very simplistic understanding of science, as well as like the relationship that science and religion can have. I think coming out of that and realizing like no, religiosity is studied, like I mentioned, and this is kind of what I believe now. Like I am an atheist. I have a very secular conception of the world, but in a literal sense, I'm agnostic in that. I mean, I could be wrong. It's something more bigger than our brains can understand. Like, sure. But I say I'm atheist because I feel like a lot of this stuff is answerable in science, including like the mental health piece, right? So like I had my own mental health journey, which made me understand that mental health isn't a dichotomy. You're not normal or schizophrenic. You're not normal and then OCD. You're not normal and then have anger management. You're not normal and then have depression. Like most of the stuff is a continuum, and learning about some of the research and the ways that, like I mentioned, like prophets might have been schizotypal, right? Like maybe not full schizophrenics, but being schizotypal is actually a bit more normalized in our society. Like having like soft visions and dreams, like a lot of this stuff makes sense. The way that like rituals are a part of every religion, and the continuum of like obsessive compulsive disorder, and the ways that our rituals are largely around like cleaning ourselves, cleaning food, like very clearly parallel to our modern conceptions. These things to me are really exciting and interesting because I feel like they provide new perspective of the stuff that I grew up with, while still respecting people being religious, obviously. But those things to me were exciting to, and like mind shifting to read about.
Mm.
E2.
I think that again earlier, because okay, Vincent, how many years ago was it now that you, just to give some context to our listeners, because definitely what I'm going to share about construction is at a different place in my journey than what you're going to share.
Oh,
but
yeah.
how it's been, what, 5
Probably
years?
4 years,
4 years? Okay.
ago I started, and I would say 2 years ago I just was officially like just claimed to be not Christian.
Yeah. And so I think, like I mentioned earlier, like it was end of last year, end of 2019, that I really, and it was probably not until the spring of this year that I was really comfortable, like in a broader sense, saying, and wasn't still having residual fears of like, am I wrong and going to hell? You know.
You are and you are, but
Yeah.
carry on.
But for me, I think that a big part of my construction is, like I mentioned before, but to put it more simply, it's allowing what I'm absorbing and how many pathways there are to exploring this existence, allowing what I learned to give rise to not even new narratives. Whereas before it was like making what I learned fit into a narrative that I subscribe to above all else. Now it's like it doesn't even have to give rise to a narrative. It's just building. It's like notes rising and it's coming around. It doesn't have to be a tune that makes sense or is always pleasing. You know what I mean? It's just like an openness to, you know what I mean? It's much more beautiful way of experiencing the world. And so there's that. And then the direction, I think,
Very
my construction.
postmodern of you. That whole repulsion of narratives. Jordan Peterson is shaking. Sorry, go ahead.
I don't have the knowledge to know exactly what you're saying, but I appreciate it. Thank you.
I digress.
All my demons are like screaming out at the top of my.
I'm triggering Kevin a little bit. Jordan Peterson is a conservative lecturer that hates
yeah, I know he's come
postmodernism.
up. I know he's come up. Yeah. And I think that the heavy bend of, I agree, Vincent, with everything you said. And I think that the field that I'm most drawn to, and heavy shout out to my sister, because she's definitely influenced this, because, you know, she was obviously raised Christian too. And she went through deconstruction much earlier than me, like when she was in college, and she's 3 years older than me. So it's been a hot minute for her. But definitely, it's heavily influenced by her, but also I think was always innate. I just didn't have the words for it because I've always been so fascinated by quantum physics. And I think I've told, right? Like I told, we were talked about last year when I visited. It was like, well, if you were to ever like go back to school or study something else, like what would it be? And I like brought up quantum physics because I just always viewed it as such a like possible place for some broader truth. It didn't have the words. It's basically just exploring like what gives rise to what we now perceive as the universe and existence. And quantum physics is the study of matter and energy at its most fundamental level. And I didn't know there was a broader field of study, which is cosmology, that quantum physics is only part of, and that's really what that's what was drawing me to quantum physics. But at its core, it's like, okay, the universe is always expanding, and cosmology is just basically examining. From my granted beginning understanding, I have so much to explore with it, but it's like, what is that? How has that happened? What does that mean? That's a really bad explanation, but just Google cosmology and I feel like you'll see. um, and to wrap that short little statement, like I mentioned to both of you before we started this episode that I watched the first episode of the new Cosmos last night, and he says this thing in it. He says, I wrote it down. How did we become a way for the universe to know itself? And by we, he's talking about humans. And those are the types of questions that very much excite me. And not even, and it doesn't have to just focus, that's focusing on humans, obviously. And that's just one mildly interesting part of it. Like, I'm not interested in the human-centric exploration, but like that in itself, right? Like, we were created through these series of processes over so much time. Our ancestors for hundreds of thousands of years lived in egalitarian societies in harmony with the earth and with each other. Now there's this new strain of us that have arisen that's clearly quite toxic.
Fucked it all up.
We are the worst iteration that has arisen. But you know, that question of like, how did that happen? What are the processes that led to us becoming the type of sentient beings that we are, that can think about ourselves outside of ourselves, can understand space-time, can build machines that will voyage out into the universe and send us back information? You know, as far as we know, we're the most advanced in our little patch of the universe. Like, that's just, and that then could lead into the type of questions Vincent's talking about, like, what is morality when viewed from that lens? Mm-hmm. What are the processes that led to us even arising to the level of sentience that we are, and what that means? So that's probably that will be a heavy influence on it as my construction continues, those types of forays. But I think it's beautiful because it has both some macro and micro applications, where just because I think I used to not be as interested when I was a Christian, and it's because to me it was like, well, if the most important thing is Jesus Christ, reconciling to Jesus Christ and eternity with him and helping as many people find that truth as possible, why would I be as interested in the rest of it? It doesn't apply, or I don't see how it does. Like, God clearly didn't think it was important enough to be told to us. So it's just sort of like very interesting, but wasted time, right? If that's, whereas now it's like, oh man, I'm losing my thought train. What was it? Oh man, it was really good. Sorry. This always happens. This is good though, because this is how I thought the whole episode was gonna go. So at least it's only me talking right at the end. The macro, I gauged it with the macro though, and I think I also used to think it could be like, whoa, if you like zoom out to that level, how am I even supposed to view my tiny little like blip in the universe as even meaningful or built? But it's actually right in line with what you learn when you start to dip into cosmology, which is like, you think about the fact, and again, shout out to my sister, because we just had this conversation last night. It was like so fun and beautiful, but like, you know, she was talking about how what makes us up, like at the most fundamental level, like quarks, there really isn't any solid truth there. Like, quarks operate in a whole different reality than what they make up, which is our reality. And then we operate in a totally different reality than like how space-time functions in like the broader universe. And so it's like, it doesn't negate the meaning, in my opinion, at least where I am now. Like, check in a year and we'll see if I'm totally cynical and just like, you know, life has no meaning. But it doesn't negate like that we have the possibility for human love, that we have the possibility to pour into each other, that the sun and the sky and the mountains and the sea are beautiful. While also then being able to zoom out and be like, wow, in the grand scheme of things, how you want to weigh truth on a cosmic scale, like we're really nothing. Yeah.
This, I know, the humans, whether you want to call it the soul, the person out beyond the human body, is composed of things that no person fully, no system, no branch of science fully understands. Nobody can explain nobody can explain truly why we have dreams. Nobody can explain why, if you look at a person and their motivations and how they behave in contrast to how they talk, they're full of contradicting motives and autonomous entities inside of them that operate their emotions and their mind and their motivations and their agendas and their actions. We're such complex creatures beyond just the physical composition of who we are. That when you frame it like that, of like just something as simple as quirks or capable of like love, it's like, yeah, we understand that. Like those are kind of easy things to understand, but they're so unique in the fact that, like, because we're so used to them that they're commonplace. But if you really sit back
I meant quirks. Sorry, not quirks. But yes.
Corks?
Quark,
Like, what do you mean?
Quirk or
Quark.
cork?
Quark.
Like a cork on a wine bottle?
No. Hang on, let me make sure that I don't.
Are you dropping scientific terms?
Quark, any of a number of subatomic particles carrying a fractional electric charge. Okay, this is just a very jargony. But basically, quarks are at the fundamental level, like literally what makes us up. And quarks, until an outcome happens, there's no way to predict. They exist in a state of uncertainty. That's what I mean. And then, but then you take a bunch of quarks together and blah, 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 increasing complexity. And then here we are. And like, I'm definitely here and I can like touch myself. And like, I just pointed at you. Whereas like the things that are literally making me up, like, do not exist in any state of certainty.
Okay, yeah. But yeah, just that idea of like human beings being this very, not mysterious is such a flattened word, but human beings being this thing physically and in our inner personhood beyond what we are physically, that is so far beyond what our mind is able to wrap its hand around and like really truly understand and comprehend. Yeah, no, there's just until you have someone like a quantum physics person or a science person or like a psychologist, like clinical, like a person explain it to you, we kind of really don't get it. When you have someone talk about how fucking weird we are as creatures and so much that goes into us, it's like, oh shit, like this is, it feels almost like a simulation or like this story someone made up, or like this shit is like too much for me to like take. I don't want to hear, close my ears, I don't want to hear none, but it's beautiful and it's mysterious. And if you can accept the gravity of not understanding it, it kind of makes you realize you don't have to be in control or understand everything. You kind of just be like Leslie and like freely just embrace like freedom and own motivations and kind of what you want to aim yourself at in life and how you want to construct that life around you. Shit, you don't gotta fall into someone's paradigm.
Cuttlefish and also like squids and I think it's cuttlefish and squids down there in the sea. They have the ability. Have you ever watched a video on that? They have the ability to change color, to change into all kinds of shapes, like their body. Like I learned squids, I think it's squids. Their brain is broken up to where it's in their arms too. Like it's not just here. So like when they touch something, their mind is interacting with something. And you sit over here. So I think all that to say, I've also been thinking, it's not just humans. We've decided that we're the most intelligent, and yes, we have been uniquely.
I am.
Yeah, we uniquely again are like the worst iteration that evolution. In that we've used our intelligence to destroy each other and our planet. But I just think, I mean, down there, if cuttlefish did have the ability to know, like they'd probably think, oh man, those poor land-dwelling suckers, like, you know, like they can't even. Their brain's just in one tiny little piece at the top of their body. You know, like. They literally can't change color to match, like, you know, it's like we've decided our form of intelligence is like part of what makes us human. I feel like we think of because like we're the most smart, as opposed to just like, well, the application of our intelligence, this is how we've chosen to do it. And we've chosen to dominate others and each other. Yeah. But again, to me, that's a hopeful, beautiful thing. It's like, wow, like how great that we're not, how great actually that we're not the best nature has to offer necessarily, or like,
Nah, I'm gonna go eat me some cuttlefish tonight.
It's actually really good. Not gonna lie.
I'm a
Fried
slurp.
cuttlefish, the strips.
I'm gonna slurp they little delicious ass. So you change colors if you want to. You still going down the same hatch.
Oh,
My parting thought is Leslie's wrong. Cuttlefish aren't the best that this world has to offer. The hoes that I'm in love with are the best that this universe has to offer. If
The
you one of
hoes are
the
laughing.
if you one of the hoes that I've written poetry about or that I've crushed on for the past 10 years and that I still stalk on Twitter and Instagram, but I don't follow you, you are the greatest creature.
Yes, to this
All right.
level of being willing to put it out there.
Yeah, I still 10 plus years. I was like, yo, you got 10 year mom. What is that? What's
Not
that
10
thing?
years.
What's that thing? My queen is living for rent free in Trump's head or some shit. Girl, you living rent free up in here. 10 years. You got 10 years.
What's it called when like a university professor hits a certain tenure and they have like they can? What's
Isn't
that
it
called?
just called tenure?
Oh, maybe
That
it
was 10
is.
year. That was 10 year.
Yeah.
All right, cool.
They
Yeah,
have
homegirl
they hit
got that
tenure.
tenure. Yeah.
Yeah.
They got retirement and everything. Their job's not at stake. They got
And
stability.
it ain't many of them. It's about 1 or 2. Oh shit! If you the girl that I'm talking to right now, you listening to this, I'm joking. Not really, but I'm joking.
Would she even know?
Well, no, she would know that I haven't known her for 10 years. So if I'm over here talking about I've been stalking some girls on Twitter,
You just
You just shot yourself in the foot.
oh shit!
But the
no.
likelihood that the girl you're talking to makes it through this whole
She
episode
not
and is
gonna-
listening right up until the last 10 seconds, I mean, you're probably clear.
Let me tell you something.
Probably okay.
She hasn't clicked a single episode. She is such an oddball. She not gonna click a single fucking episode. Not because like she like we're not because we're doing a bad not because we're not doing a bad not because we're doing a bad job, but this is uninteresting. She's just such a fucking enigma that like I don't think she cares for anything, including me. So like let alone this fucking up let alone this episode.
We can talk
We're
about this
g-
after we stop
oh
recording.
shit.
I'm
This is
curious.
the life this podcast has turned into the life of Kevin. What's up, ladies and gentlemen? If you joined us, if you just hopped in, we're
Thank
talking
you for
about
joining part 2 of this episode. Kevin's every personal life detail.
all right, somebody close this out before I talk too much.
Thank you for listening to the Bottomless Podcast. BTTMLESS is how you spell our name, and we're on Twitter, Instagram, Spotify, Apple Music, and
YouTube.
yeah, we just really YouTube. We really appreciate you guys listening, and of course, it goes without saying, but maybe it does need to be said. We have respect for people of every faith, and we really appreciate just if you listen to this whole conversation, we appreciate you joining us on this candid, raw talk.
Facts. Fucking
Period.
facts. Thank you.